So, doctor, I dreamt I was Chuck Norris being chased by a giant cheeseburger down a hall, and then he turned into a bunch of bees, and the bees were flying after us and stinging us like crazy. Then my best friend was there, but he turned into this wisecracking coelacanth. What could it all mean?
It means you're crazy. The term psychotherapy refers to treatments that use psychological rather than biological means to treat emotional and behavioral disorders. It refers to those psychological techniques that are used to facilitate like a positive change in an individual's personality, behavior, or adjustment to society. One of the first psychotherapies ever developed was Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis. So many people argue that he created the first true psychotherapy. And the big idea behind psychoanalysis, Freud's psychotherapy, the big idea behind psychoanalysis was that an individual's problems are hidden. So the individual's problems are caused by these hidden factors that he argued were, represented in the unconscious mind. And the main goal of his psychoanalysis was to try to get at that hidden content, try to figure out what these hidden problems are that are in the unconscious mind and help the client to deal with them to reduce the emotional distress that they cause. Now, we'll talk in more detail about the different kinds of therapies that are out there, but psychoanalysis is definitely a very good example of what's called a directive therapy, in the sense that it has like an interview format. So it's very formal in that sense. The client sits down and the counselor talks to them. Stereotypically, the client is like laying down on a couch or something like that. But it's all taken very seriously. It's serious business. Now, the techniques that are employed in psychoanalysis are pretty varied. There's lots of different things that the psychotherapist can do. But some of the most popular techniques would include things like dream analysis, free association, interpretation, resistance analysis, transference analysis, and counter-transference analysis. If you notice, most of these have the word analysis in them, and remember, that's because we're trying to analyze the content of what the client is saying and doing to try to figure out what that unconscious, conflict is all about. So by far the two primary psychoanalytic techniques would include dream analysis and free association. And with dream analysis, you just have the client report a recently experienced dream, just in as much detail as they possibly can. And as the psychoanalyst, you're just basically listening, taking notes, and looking for themes, looking for recurring ideas, and trying to analyze those symbols in the dreams. The dreams are not meant to be taken literally. They have a coded meaning in a sense. And then with free association, it's basically the same thing, except now instead of having the client report a recently experienced dream, now you're just having them talk about whatever it is they want to talk about whatever's on their mind, but just have the client keep talking. And just like dream analysis, you're looking for those kinds of themes that might be related to their unconscious conflict. So psychoanalysis, traditionally, the classic form of psychoanalysis, it's not really practiced anymore. Modern psychoanalysis is, for the most part, what we would call brief psychodynamic. So brief psychodynamic therapy is based on classic psychoanalysis, but it's designed to be much more efficient, much more quick. It uses much more direct questioning to try to reveal those unconscious conflicts. And that's something you'll see in most psychotherapies today. Most psychotherapies today are definitely geared to being more efficient when it comes to producing results. But the kind of results these different therapies are trying to produce are quite different. For example, there are many different dimensions to psychotherapy. Not all psychotherapies are the same. Some psychotherapies are more insight-focused. So that means the goal of the therapy is to try to help the client get a better understanding of their own thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Whereas other therapies are more action-focused, where the goal of that kind of therapy is to bring about direct changes in troublesome thoughts, habits, feelings, or behavior. So it's not really about understanding yourself better, it's about changing yourself. Another dimension to the various psychotherapies that are out there is whether it's more directive or non-directive. As I just explained, when it comes to psychoanalysis is a great example of a directive therapy. The client sits in a chair and the counselor asks them questions. So that's what a directive therapy looks like. You clearly have like a leader and a follower. But many other therapies are what we call non-directive. With that, it's more so like a collaborative relationship. It's more so like a normal friendship where both people are helping each other. There's no clear leader. There's no clear guide. It's just the client is there. The therapist is there to simply help the client solve their own problems. And then another dimension would be whether the therapy is focused on, individual, like one-on-one style therapy, or whether it's more so a group therapy. And many of these different therapies we're going to talk about today can be either one-on-one, individual therapy, or they can be group-based. And then one more dimension would be whether the therapy is more open-ended or time-limited. And as I said, with classical psychoanalysis, it definitely was more open-ended. Like, the therapy is relatively unlimited in terms of how long it could last. So you could be seeing that therapist for years. You could have hundreds of sessions. And you don't really have any idea when that relationship's going to end. It's just whenever the client and the counselor feel that they've come to a good conclusion. Whereas with more modern psychoanalysis and most modern therapies, they tend to be more time limited. And that just generally means before you even get started with this, therapy, the client and the counselor, they both agree how long each session should last and how many sessions there's probably going to be. So they know long before the end of that relationship when that relationship's going to end. Besides psychoanalysis, there's many other kinds of therapies. Most of these haven't gotten as much publicity as Freudian psychoanalysis, but they definitely are major techniques that are used and have had huge influence on the field of psychotherapy, like humanism, for example. Humanistic therapies. These tend to also be insight-focused, just like psychoanalysis, but they're much more non-directive. So these are insight therapies that are intended to help the client get a better understanding of themselves, and the client and counselor work together to achieve that kind of insight. One of the big ideas behind humanistic therapies is that there's this belief that humans have a natural urge to seek health and self-growth, and that it's possible for them to live, to use their potential to live full, rich, and rewarding lives. Like, people want to be better. They want to grow as individuals. Where in contrast with psychoanalysis, Freud argued that patients, they seek therapy simply because they want to overcome some misery. So the difference is overcoming misery to trying to maximize your potential to live a more full and rewarding life. Now, the primary kind of humanistic therapy that's out there like the major form of this would be client-centered therapy, which was developed by Carl Rogers. So as I already mentioned, like the other humanistic therapies, client-centered therapy is a non-directive kind of therapy, where the client and counselor work together, and it's definitely focused on helping the client to grow and change and more, fully develop their capabilities. And the primary way that this is done is by creating what's called a safe atmosphere for growth. So what the counselor is supposed to do, what the therapist is supposed to do, is just basically provide the opportunity, provide an environment where the client can solve their own problems. Just provide like a safe and nurturing environment where the client can achieve their own insights. Of course, the counselor is there to help them along the way, but it's really up to the client to make that change. And I have a video down in the comments showing Carl Rogers demonstrating and explaining his form of psychotherapy. So if you're interested to see what client-centered therapy looks like, then I definitely recommend checking out that video. But in the video, in the beginning of that video, he's going to talk about this safe atmosphere for growth and the various conditions that are required to see insight, this kind of insight being, developed in the client. So he only mentions 3, but modern client-centered therapy includes 4. So the first major condition is just showing a caring, like a spontaneous kind of non-possessive love. Nowadays we call this like unconditional positive regard for that client. So the therapist has to actually genuinely care about the client and want the client to get better. Another one would be empathy or perspective taking or whatever you want to call it, but the counselor has to be able to understand what the client is going through, to be able to see the world from the client's eyes, to feel what they're feeling. The third condition would be authenticity or genuineness, or you could also call it congruence. But the whole idea here is the counselor, the therapist, has to be able to be open and honest with the client. As Carl Rogers would say, he would like the client to be able to see all the way through him, so that nothing is hidden, nothing is not expressed. But as Carl Rogers says in the video, sometimes you don't really have a good opinion about your client, and because you should be completely open and honest, that kind of stuff will often be expressed and should be expressed. But it's important to try to express those negative feelings in a more constructive way. And if you can't express them in a constructive way, if you persistently dislike your client, then maybe you shouldn't be working with that client. And then the fourth condition, one that he doesn't mention, is reflection. So the therapist has to be able to take in the kinds of verbal and nonverbal messages that the client is giving them and interpret those and give them back to that client. So you have to basically rephrase to reflect the messages that you're receiving back at that client and in an appropriate and helpful way. A kind of therapy that's related to humanistic therapies would be existential therapies. So these have a lot in common with the humanistic therapies. And basically, they're also insight-focused, and they're also non-directive. So in many ways, they look the same. But the difference here is that with existential therapy, the focus now is not on becoming the best person you could be. Now the focus is on dealing with those problems of existence in this world, such as the meaning of life, the meaning of death, the understanding that you have the capacity for free choice, and you need to accept the responsibility of those choices you make. So there's definitely a lot of emphasis put on the concept of free will and the consequences of having a free will. So most of the time in existential therapy, what you're talking about is just the decisions you've made in your life and what that means about you and how you could possibly change those decisions. Change your position in life so that you can have more positive consequences. One of the major techniques that's used in existential therapy is confrontation, where the client is challenged to examine their values, challenged to examine their life choices, and understand that it's because of those choices, it's because of those values that they have gotten to the place they are today. And if they don't like the place they are today, they need to accept that as being, the result of their choices. One particular kind of existential therapy would be logotherapy, which was developed by Viktor Frankl. Now, Viktor, he developed this kind of therapy primarily based on his childhood. He was a Holocaust survivor. He grew up in one of the camps, so every single day as a young boy, he wasn't fully aware of what's going on, but every single day he would notice that people he knew his whole life were disappearing and never coming back. And it wasn't until later that he realized that those people were being killed on a daily basis. And that really made him, fundamentally question the meaning of life. Like, if life is so easily dispensable, what's the point of living? And because of these ideas, because of having to deal with this kind of, really dark kind of stuff at a very young age, he developed this idea that was later turned into logotherapy. And the whole idea is that there is no real objective meaning to life. Instead, you need to find your own meaning, and you need to maintain that meaning and hold on to it very tightly, because if you don't have a meaning to your life, you'll quickly fall into depression and likely be very, very unhappy. So it's very important. It's a necessity to find and maintain a meaning in your life. And that's what logo means. Logos means like a sense of meaning. Now, something similar to both humanism and existential therapy would be Gestalt therapy, which was developed by Fritz and Laura Perls. So some people would argue this is just like a form of humanistic therapy, but it's different from Carl Rogers' version. So Carl Rogers' version, remember, that's insight focused and it's about maximizing your potential. Whereas with Gestalt therapy, now we're focusing on the immediate experience, like the situation you find yourself in right now, like in this room, and helping the client to understand what's going on in this current situation. And in doing so, this will help them to build their awareness and kind of reconnect the different aspects of their lives. That's what Gestalt is all about. Gestalt is all about integrating the different parts of your life, integrating the different experiences you have, and understanding that all these different things that you do, all these different things that you think, are connected in a bigger picture. And just like existential therapy, clients are taught to accept the responsibility for their thoughts, for their choices, and so on. Now, while this is still non-directive, it's a little bit more directive than like person-centered or existential. And if you want to see an example of this Gestalt therapy in action, I have a link for that as well. And it also includes Fritz Perls talking, like introducing this kind of therapy and explaining what it's all about. In fact, this video and the one of Carl Rogers that I mentioned earlier, they're both part of the same video series. So those are parts 1 and 2. Another kind of therapy would be cognitive therapy. And this definitely focuses more so on the client's thoughts and how those thoughts, how those thinking patterns can then lead to problematic behavior and emotion. Now, since it was first developed, cognitive therapy has been shown to be very effective at treating a wide range of problems, from generalized anxiety disorder to post-traumatic stress, marital problems, anger issues, and it's been shown to be especially successful in treating various kinds of depression. Now, one of the first kinds of cognitive therapies that were developed was rational-emotive-behavior therapy, and that was developed by Albert Ellis. So the primary idea behind rational-emotive-behavior therapy is that we need to try to change those irrational beliefs that clients will tell themselves, because those irrational beliefs, those are the cause for the client's emotional problems and behavioral problems. And the way we do that, the way we change those irrational ideas that clients tell themselves over and over, is through a process called cognitive restructuring. So with cognitive restructuring, you try to help the client to identify the irrational aspects of these things they tell themselves, and then you try to replace them with more rational alternatives through what's called didactic teaching. Now, if you want to see Albert Ellis explain in more detail what this kind of therapy is all about and see a demonstration of it, I have a link to that as well. So this is the third part in that video series I mentioned earlier. I also have another video where you can just get to know a little bit more about Albert Ellis and why and how he developed his kind of rational emotive behavior therapy. But one of the primary ideas, one of the biggest ideas behind rational emotive behavior therapy is that the things that happen to us don't cause us to feel one way or another. It's not like an event will cause a reaction. Instead, it's our beliefs that cause us to feel one way or another. So what I'm talking about now is Albert Ellis's ABC theory. So as you can see in this model, we have point A, which is the activating event or adversity. And most of us believe that it's those events, it's those like traumatic events that happen to us that cause us, that produce, those emotional and behavioral consequences. So most of us believe on some level that it's that event, it's point A, that causes those consequences at point C. But Albert Ellis made it abundantly clear that that is not correct. Instead, that activating event or adversity, first we develop a set of beliefs about that event, and it's those beliefs that cause us to have those emotional and behavioral consequences. So A does not lead to C. A leads to B, which then leads to C. And it's that point B that we can focus on. Like, we can't go back in time and change what happened to you, but we can look very closely at what your beliefs are and use cognitive restructuring to fix those irrational aspects of those beliefs. Here are the three most common, the three core irrational beliefs that people tend to have. So these are the common ideas that people have that need to be corrected using cognitive restructuring. So first of all, people tend to have this feeling that they must do a great job. They must perform very well and be approved of by others, important other people. And if they don't do a good job, if they don't get that approval, then this is an awful thing. They cannot stand to be, such a loser. They cannot stand to be a bad person. It's just unbearable. Obviously, you're not always going to do a great job. Obviously, you're going to let people down sometimes. So you need to just keep in mind that this doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means you messed up this time. But like I said, these are irrational beliefs, so people don't really think about it that way. Another major irrational belief, another core irrational belief would be that people must treat me fairly. And if people don't treat me fairly, then it's horrible and I cannot bear it. It's like this is a horrible circumstance and justice must be, done upon this person that's not treating me fairly. People get treated unfairly all the time. It's just the nature of the world that people aren't always going to get their fair treatment, their fair share. And we need to try to explain to the client or whoever is having this irrational idea that that's just the case. There's not, it's not fun, sure it's not nice, but it doesn't mean that the world is an unbearable place to live in. It just means that person is being unfair to you. That's all it means. And then the third core irrational belief that you tend to see over and over again is that things have to go my way. Like, conditions must be the way I planned. And if things don't go according to my plan, that's terrible. And I cannot stand living in a world that doesn't, serve me in that sense. I don't really need to explain why this is silly, but it really seems quite common that people will get extremely agitated, extremely upset if things don't go according to their plan. And they obviously can't stand to be inconvenienced in this way. But you just need to try to make it clear to a person who has this kind of belief that things most often aren't going to go their way, and they need to just understand that that doesn't mean that things are bad. It just means things aren't, the way that they thought they would be. Sometimes if things don't go your way, it's actually better. And one other kind of therapy would be behavior therapy. And unlike all the other ones I've talked about, behavior therapy is an action therapy. So just remember what that means. That means that it focuses on making changes in the client's behavior or thoughts. It's not really about helping the client understand themselves better. It's just about changing them. So behavior therapists assume that people have learned to be the way they are. So through experience, through learning, they have become the person that they are. And similarly, by more experience, by more learning, they can change who they are. So we don't really need to concern ourselves with why you are this way. All we need to concern ourselves with is how can we make you into something that you want to be? How can we modify your behavior in such a way that it will benefit yourself and others? So that is definitely one of the primary techniques. It's called behavior modification, or sometimes it's referred to as applied behavior analysis, where we just use those classical and operant conditioning techniques talked about much earlier in this series to try to make direct changes in human behavior. One example of this kind of behavior therapy would be aversion therapy. And as I'm about to explain, as you're about to see, all these different kinds of behavior therapies, they're very simple in theory. But when it comes to actually practicing them, it definitely takes a lot of experience and training. Because remember, timing is everything. Consistency is everything. You really need to be very diligent when it comes to performing these kinds of therapies. But theoretically, you already understand them. Like I was saying, aversion therapy is extremely simplistic in how it works. You just want to associate something that's aversive with an undesirable behavior. Like maybe you could associate a disgusting garbage smell with smoking. Like if you're trying to quit smoking, just go stand next to a garbage can every time you want to smoke, and that association that's going to develop is going to make you want to smoke less. Or here's another example. You could just apply like a painful shock to yourself every time you go to eat more than you're supposed to. So you could use this kind of shock therapy in a sense to help train yourself to eat less, because in that case you'll be associating pain with overeating. And this kind of basic theoretical framework is how systematic desensitization works. You may have heard of systematic desensitization. It's just using like classical and operant conditioning techniques to reduce fear, anxiety, or aversion. Because what we're doing with systematic desensitization is we are associating this feared stimulus with no fear. So typically what you do is you perform these relaxation techniques like meditation or guided imagery or whatever. And while doing that, you are gradually exposed to that feared stimulus. So you're being exposed to this fearful stimulus while simultaneously maintaining a calm and relaxed state. And you can either do this, in person, like you yourself, or you can do it vicariously. And by that I just mean you can watch other people interact with that feared object and show no fear. So this is much more like observational learning, where now we have this model of appropriate emotional behavior. But one of the more promising techniques when it comes to this kind of desensitization, because it seems to be exceptionally effective, is virtual reality exposure therapy, where now you put on this virtual reality headset and you're exposed to a realistic version of this fearful stimulus while simultaneously knowing it's not real. So it looks real, it probably sounds real, but it's not real because it's you're in this virtual kind of world. So because it's not real, you don't feel the fear, but it looks real. So just by virtue of what it is, you are associating this feared situation, this feared stimulus, with no fear. So that's why it can be so effective. And I have a video in the link, and the links down below, showing in more detail what this virtual reality exposure therapy looks like.